On my son's wedding day, 400 guests in a Sydney harbourside ballroom watched my future daughter-in-law's father point his champagne flute at me and laugh. He called me a stain on the linen. He called me roadkill that had wandered in from the highway. In their eyes, I was nothing but a broken-down old man in a charity shop suit, fortunate to be drawing breath in the same room as their bloodline. My son's bride-to-be stood there in her $30,000 gown, her shoulders shaking with laughter, certain that my boy had won some kind of golden ticket by marrying her. But the moment I rose from that crooked little chair near the kitchen door and walked out into the cold harbor air, was the moment they unknowingly stepped into the worst week of their lives. A week they had drafted, signed, and sealed entirely by themselves. Welcome back to Home Voices. Pour yourself a cup of tea, settle into the lounge, and remember this. Every person in these stories had every chance in the world to choose decency. They simply chose otherwise. Drop a comment and tell me which town you're listening from, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the country and beyond. The smell of warming oysters and the heat from the swinging kitchen door behind my back filled the air around table 46. The Whitlock family had placed me there on purpose, the seat reserved for the embarrassing relatives nobody wants in the photographs. Above me, the chandeliers threw shards of light across the room, but to my eyes those crystals only lit up the layers of pretense draped across every shoulder. The sapphires hanging from Margaret Whitlock's neck caught the light like cold little knives. I sat with my weathered hands folded in my lap. My old gray suit, the one I had worn to my wife's funeral 9 years ago, looked painfully out of place beside the tailored Italian dinner jackets the so-called elite were wearing like a second skin. I looked across the room at my son, Callum. He stood near the head table, his face the color of paper, humiliated by the very young woman he was about to marry. His bride, Imogen, walked toward my table. The sharp clack of her heels against the polished floor sounded like a butcher's blade being pulled across a steel. She did not look at me the way a young woman looks at her future father-in-law. She looked at me the way she might look at a smear on the carpet that someone had forgotten to clean. She leaned close. Her perfume was suffocating, all jasmine and money. She whispered through a stiff smile that my presence was ruining the framing of her wedding photographs, and that the photographer had asked, very politely, if I might consider waiting outside in the courtyard until the formalities were done. The Whitlock family laughter cracked across the room. It was not the sound of celebration. It was the sound of a portcullis dropping, sealing me out from the kind of world they believed I had no business standing in. Her father, Reginald Whitlock, raised a glass of red worth more than a fortnight of an honest worker's wages. He announced to the table beside him that the Whitlock name had survived 4 generations of breeding and would not be diluted, in his words, by a deadbeat from out west. Callum opened his mouth to defend me. I caught his eye and shook my head, just once, and laid my hand gently on the back of his chair as I passed. The pain of seeing my son humiliated rolled through my chest like a slow tide, but I did not let a single twitch of it reach my face. Real power is a quiet thing. It does not need to shout. It simply waits, like gravity, and lets everything fall in its own time. Tell me, mate, what would you do if your family were treated this way in front of 400 strangers? Hit the like button and drop a comment with the number 1 if you'd stand up for the people the world looks down on. I rose from the cheap folding chair they had set aside for me. The legs scraped against the timber floor with a noise that made several heads turn. I said nothing to any of them. I simply walked out through the wide oak doors and into the cool dark of the courtyard. Callum hurried after me, leaving the proud bride standing at her father's elbow. I knew, in that moment, that my boy had made his choice as well. I drew my battered old phone from the inside pocket of my jacket. My thumb moved across the screen with the calm of a man who had pressed the same button for 35 years. I rang my assistant. The line was answered before the second tone. My voice, when it left my throat, was no longer the voice of a tired old father from the suburbs. It was steady, low, and final. The way an order is read aloud in a courtroom. I told her to begin step 1. Within 9 minutes, the entire scaffolding of credit and goodwill propping up the proud Whitlock name would start to crack. I stood under the harbor lights and looked back through the tall windows of the ballroom one last time. Tonight, those people would learn something they had refused to learn from 40 years of opportunity. Sometimes a man in a charity shop suit carries the heart and the means of an empire builder. The old ute groaned along the back roads heading west out of the city. Callum drove, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. The silence between us was thick as wet wool. I glanced across at him. A single tear had slipped down his cheek and been swallowed by the dark of the cab. He had just walked away from a young woman he believed he loved. He had thrown his pride aside to stand beside the old father the room had just laughed at. I felt every bit of his pain. It was a raw, open burn. The Whitlocks had not just humiliated me. They had used my son's love as a lever to crush his self-respect. Imogen had stood there at the altar with that small curl of her lip, as though she already knew Callum would never have the spine to leave her. And if he ever did, she would discard him as easily as she'd toss out a handbag that had gone out of season. Every glance, every whispered slight, every theatrical eye roll across that ballroom had been logged in the quiet ledger of an old man's mind. What that bride did not know was that she had just woken something inside me that had been sleeping for a very long time. We pulled up at the rough fibro cottage at the end of a long dirt track an hour out of town. The roof had moss on the iron sheeting, and the veranda sagged on one side. This was the house the Whitlocks had been told I lived in. The house they were sure I would die in, alone, with my pension book and a tin of beans. Callum stepped out of the ute, his shoulders heavy with shame. He looked at the old place, then at me, and quietly said he was sorry for letting me sit through any of that. He said we'd start again from nothing if we had to. The two of us, with our own hands. I said nothing. I walked beside him through the dusty front room with its old kettle and faded photo of his mother on the sideboard. I led him to the corner of the kitchen, behind a battered timber dresser stacked with chipped plates. I pressed my palm against a panel of weathered wood, and a hidden biometric reader hummed beneath it. A soft, hydraulic hiss broke the silence. The dresser slid aside. Behind it, a narrow steel staircase descended into the earth. Callum froze. He stared at me as though he had never seen me before in his life. We walked down. White light from a quiet, automatic system flickered to life as we descended, pushing the darkness back along the walls. The chamber at the bottom carried no smell of damp earth. It was a sleek, climate-controlled command room. 12 broad monitors lined the curved wall, each one alive with quiet rivers of green code, ticker symbols, satellite feeds, and balance sheets. This was the still heart of Hardigan Pacific Holdings, the company I had founded the year my wife and I were married. From this small room, beneath an old cottage on a dirt track, I had directed billions of dollars across this country and beyond, all while wearing a faded work shirt to the local shops on a Saturday morning. I stood in front of the screens, their light reflected in my eyes, cold and patient. I was no longer the old man at table 46. Callum could not move. He could not blink. He stared at the figures dancing across the displays, his lips moving without sound, and finally asked me, in a voice no louder than a whisper, what all of this was. I turned to my son. My voice was even. I told him real wealth is silent. Real wealth is patience. I told him I had waited a long time for this evening to come. Not to flaunt anything, not to win anything, but to teach him what a human being is actually worth. I asked my assistant Amelia to come up on the main screen. Her face appeared at once, calm, professional, hair pulled back, ready as she had been every morning of the last 20 years. I gave the order. Every last student loan and credit balance my boy had ever signed his name to, every burden he had quietly carried while pretending to me he was fine, dissolved into nothing at the press of a key. He watched the numbers go, but that was only the warm-up. The next instruction I gave was a clean, surgical freeze on every line of credit linked to the Whitlock family, from the black cards Imogen used at her boutiques on the harbor to the corporate accounts Reginald had been quietly using to prop up his shell companies for the last 18 months. By the time those people walked out of the ballroom tonight and tried to settle the bar tab, every card in their wallets would be a square of useless plastic. My revenge was not a tantrum. It was an algorithm. Cold, calculated, irreversible. Tonight, the Whitlock family would begin to learn what happens when an empire built on contempt comes face to face with the very people it has spent decades looking down on. Callum stood in the middle of the chamber, his eyes wide. The light from the financial charts moved in soft blue patterns across his face. He looked at me, then at the screens, then at the empty hand he had been holding the wedding band in. Only an hour ago, he asked me, his voice trembling, why I had hidden all of this from him for so long, why we had lived in that little cottage with the sagging veranda for the whole of his childhood when this was sitting beneath our feet. I turned to face him fully. The white light caught the lines on my face. I told him the truth, the same truth I had promised his mother on the day he was born. I had wanted him to grow up understanding what struggle feels like, so he would never confuse his bank balance with his character. I had wanted him to take a girl to the school dance in a borrowed shirt and learn how to mean every word he said. I had wanted him to know the difference between a friend who liked him and a friend who liked his name. Numbers, Callum, lose their meaning when you have too many of them. Decency does not. Decency only grows. Then I told him my one rule. Real wealth must remain quiet. Loud people are usually the empty ones. Patience, son, is the most expensive thing a man can own, because it is the only thing he cannot buy. I directed Amelia to open Phase 2. The Whitlock Empire, on paper, looked like a pillar of polished marble. In truth, it was a sand castle, and almost every grain in it had been borrowed, at one point or another, from one of my shell companies. Reginald Whitlock had spent the last 6 years signing notes against his own name without ever realizing that the eventual holder of those debts was the same old man he had pointed at across a wedding table. I told Callum that revenge was not noise. It was precision. We were going to slowly close every valve carrying air to those people. Their construction arm, their hospitality investments, the 2 boutique hotels in the inner city, the vineyard down south they had bought as a tax shelter. None of it would fall in a single thunderclap. It would crack, hairline by hairline, until the whole structure folded in on itself under its own bloated weight. I placed a hand on my son's shoulder and told him to get some sleep on the small camp bed in the side room. Tomorrow would be a long day. The real reckoning had only just begun. The next morning, the chamber smelled of fresh coffee and quiet purpose. Callum stood in front of the main screen, no longer the broken groom of the night before. He was watching the live ticker of Whitlock Holdings International. The line was already bending toward the floor. I stood behind him with my hands in the pockets of my old jacket, simply watching the change in my boy's posture. He had straightened up in the night. I stepped beside him and laid my palm on the console. I told him that revenge, when it is done well, is a kind of mirror. The Whitlocks had come at us with humiliation. We were going to answer with truth. That is all. Nothing more, nothing less. I pulled up the list of Reginald's creditors. More than 70% of those entities, when traced back through 3 or 4 corporate veils, ended up sitting in the lap of Hardigan Pacific. Callum looked at the screen, then at me, and asked what we were going to do next. I gave him a small smile. I told him an old saying. My father, who built fences out near Dubbo for 50 years, used to repeat. When your enemy is digging himself into a hole, never take the shovel off him. Hand him a bigger one. Reginald Whitlock had spent his whole life believing that a firm handshake at the right yacht club could buy him out of any mistake. He was about to discover that those handshakes are made of paper, and paper burns. I explained to Callum the difference between visible power and the real kind. The visible kind is the chandelier in the ballroom. The real kind is the deep water current beneath a quiet harbor. The one that decides which ships make it home. I had spent 4 decades building that current. I had walked through my own empire like a ghost, so that, when the moment came to step into the room, every single decision had already been made for me. Callum looked at me with a new kind of respect. He understood now that the cheap suit I had worn to his wedding was not a sign of failure. It was a test. The Whitlocks had failed it spectacularly. Imogen had chosen a $30,000 gown over loyalty. Her father had chosen contempt over grace. Now they were going to pay with the only 2 things they had ever genuinely valued: money and reputation. I pressed a key. Amelia appeared on the screen and reported that 2 of Whitlock's partner banks had already begun calling in their loans early. Panic was already moving through Reginald's offices on Pitt Street. I turned to my son and told him this was only the opening act. We were not just going to take their money. We were going to hold up a mirror so the rest of the world could see exactly who those people had always been. If you reckon integrity is the most valuable currency in this country, hit the like button and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who only judged you on what you were wearing? I'd love to hear your story. By that afternoon, the screens in the chamber lit up with a live broadcast. Imogen Whitlock was sitting in a room banked with white roses, her eyes red with carefully arranged tears. She was speaking to several thousand viewers about how my son had been violent with her, how he had abandoned her at the altar, in front of her dying grandmother, how she now feared for her safety, and the safety of the unborn child she was, she claimed through stage-managed sobs, secretly carrying. Callum's hands closed into fists. The veins along the backs of them stood up sharply. He wanted to take the ute back into town that very minute, walk into whatever studio she was sitting in, and tell the country what kind of woman she really was. I laid a steady hand on his shoulder and told him to breathe. Anger, I said, is the enemy of clear thinking. When your enemy is making mistakes, you do not interrupt. You make them a cup of tea and let them keep talking. Imogen was digging her own pit, one shovelful of polished lies at a time. She believed social media would be her shield. What she did not know was that the platform she was streaming on belonged, through 3 layers of holding companies, to Hardigan Pacific. I asked Amelia to prepare a small gift for our young bride. A clean, calm presentation of the truth, ready to drop into her live stream at the moment of her choosing. I watched her on the screen. Her hypocrisy was something rare. She spoke of the wedding gown she had insisted on, the one her father had reluctantly written the check for, as though it had been some kind of sacrifice she had made out of love. She described our family home, the cottage with the moss on the roof, as though it were a contagious illness. Callum asked me, his voice tight, why we did not release the proof immediately and end it. I looked at him. I told him patience was part of the punishment. We would let her climb to the very top of her own pretense. We would let her gather sympathy and sponsorship deals and the hashtag of the day. And then, at the precise moment she believed she had become untouchable, we would remove the floor beneath her shoes. I asked Amelia to pull every angle of the security cameras at the Harbourside Hotel from the night of the wedding. I wanted every smirk and every whispered insult Imogen and her father had thrown across that ballroom on a clean, time-stamped reel. The hour was coming when her live stream would turn into a public courtroom, with no judge and no defense. By the end of the second day, a soft red alert pulsed on one of the side monitors. Margaret Whitlock had been admitted to a private hospital in the eastern suburbs. Within 20 minutes, Reginald had organized a press conference in the lobby of that very hospital. He stood there with his shoulders shaking, his eyes glistening, and accused our family of shocking his wife into a stroke through what he called our cruel and orchestrated campaign of harassment. He called us silent murderers in suits. I watched him on the screen and allowed myself a small, dry smile. The Whitlocks had always treated hospitals as temples of convenient lies they could pay their way through. I turned to Amelia and asked her about the financial structure of that particular hospital. She replied in her even, quiet voice. It carried a substantial loan from a private fund based in Singapore. The fund, of course, sat quietly under Hardigan Pacific. I told her to acquire that debt outright, in full, within the hour. I wanted complete authority over every camera and every corridor in that building. While Reginald continued his teary monologue to the press cameras, I had Amelia bring up the feed from his wife's so-called critical care suite. The image that came onto the central screen made Callum draw breath sharply. Margaret Whitlock was not lying still under an oxygen tube. She was upright in a silk dressing gown, dancing in slow circles to music coming from a speaker on the bedside table. A glass of red was in her hand. Imogen stood beside her, mother and daughter clinking their glasses together, laughing at the success of the whole performance. I told Amelia to relay that footage, live, onto every flat screen in the hospital lobby, directly behind Reginald, while he was still mid-sentence. The image filled every screen at once. For one full second, the room of reporters fell utterly silent. Then it erupted. Phones came up, cameras turned, whispers became questions, and questions became shouting. Reginald turned. His face shifted from theatrical pink to bone white to a sort of gray that no living face should ever wear. He saw his wife dancing. He saw his daughter raising a glass to the ceiling. He saw the entire foundation of his story collapse on national television. He tried to step in front of the screens, but the truth was already loose and traveling faster than any man could chase it. If you believe in the power of integrity, mate, hit that like button and drop a comment. Have you ever been written off because of how you looked? Tell me your story of standing your ground. A week later, Reginald Whitlock was a wounded animal looking for the nearest waterhole. His attempt at the hospital had gone catastrophically. His company stock was in freefall. He needed new capital to keep the lights on, and he needed it quickly. I knew exactly where he would surface. The Barrendale Country Club, an hour north of the city, was where the men of his world signed their last desperate deals over flat whites and bacon rolls on the breakfast terrace. I drove up the coast road myself and arrived an hour before he did. I was not in a tailored jacket. I wore the same old suit and a pair of dusty leather boots I had owned since the year my son was born. I leaned against the railing at the edge of the practice green and watched the polished men move past me in their pale linens. They glittered under the morning sun, but underneath every smile sat a calculator running far too quickly. Reginald arrived with 3 potential investors at his elbow. He was working hard to keep his old composure, talking about future projects and revised forecasts. The moment his eyes landed on me, that composure cracked clean down the middle. He left his guests where they stood and walked across the gravel toward me. He looked me up and down with the same contempt he had used at the wedding. He told me to remove myself from the property before he had the manager call the police on a vagrant. I said nothing. I simply watched him. He raised his voice. He turned to his 3 investors and gestured at me. He used me as an example, in his words, of the kind of ruined man this country had stopped knowing how to deal with. He believed humiliating me a second time, in front of new money, would put him back on top of the conversation. He had no idea he was standing on the very floor I had bought. The club manager came hurrying across the lawn, slightly out of breath. Reginald gave him a thin smile and told him, sharply, to throw me out. The manager did not look at Reginald. He turned to me, and he bowed his head. And he addressed me as Mr. Hartigan. He informed me, gently, that the transfer of the entire estate, including the 3 18-hole courses and the surrounding land, had been finalized in my name 15 minutes earlier. He apologized for the delay in the paperwork. Silence rolled across the lawn like a cold wave. The wind moved through the gum trees behind the practice green, and not a single man on that terrace dared to speak. Reginald's mouth opened and closed twice, and nothing came out of it that resembled words. The 3 investors at his back took one careful step backward, and then another. They could feel the shape of the room changing around them, and they had not survived as long as they had by being slow on their feet. I walked across the gravel and stopped a single pace from Reginald. I looked at him quietly. I told him that power is not in a membership card, and it is not in a tailored suit, and it is not in the surname carved over a doorway. Power is held by the man who owns the ground under another man's feet. I turned to the manager and asked him to remove Mr. Whitlock from the premises immediately. I did not want him on my land for one more breath. 2 security men escorted him across the gravel and out the front gate, while his investors quietly excused themselves to their cars. They had already taken out their phones to make other calls. Vultures, mate. Always know when a body is finally cold. I sat down on the wooden bench at the edge of the green and asked one of the kitchen staff for a glass of cold water. Callum walked over from where he had been standing in the shade and sat beside me. He had watched the whole thing unfold without saying a word. He understood now what I had been trying to tell him in the chamber. The deepest revenge a man can take is not violence. It is taking from the proud everything they have ever been proud of, and then leaving them alone with the silence they made for themselves. 2 days later, my office at Hartigan Pacific in the city was so quiet you could hear the second hand of the wall clock. Imogen Whitlock walked in alone. She wore a wrinkled dress that no longer fitted her properly and shoes scuffed on both heels. She lowered herself onto her knees in front of my desk. The tears that came down her face had been carefully prepared, but the fear behind them had not. She admitted she had been wrong. She begged. Then she made her last move. She told me she was carrying my son's child, and that for $150,000 she would disappear quietly, and we would never hear from her again. She believed an unborn baby was the last weapon in her drawer. She thought a fake display of motherhood would soften an old father. I looked down at her. My eyes were as cold as the surface of an alpine lake in winter. I did not see a frightened young woman. I saw a confidence trickster trying to peel the last piece of value off a sinking ship before it went under. I slid a manila folder across the desk. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a paternity report on company letterhead from the most respected pathology lab on this side of the country. I told her, gently, that she had been careless. She had left a hairbrush in our bathroom the weekend she had visited the cottage. The strands had told us everything. The child was not Callum's. The father was the personal trainer she had been quietly seeing for the 4 months before the wedding. Her face went still. There is a particular stillness that comes onto a person when their last lie has been removed from their hand. I told her something she did not deserve to hear, but I said it anyway. Hatred takes more energy than I have left at my age. I did not hate her. I felt sorry for a young woman who had traded her own honesty for a wardrobe. Callum walked into the office at that moment. He looked at the woman who had been his fiancée, and there was no anger in his face at all. There was no pain. There was only distance. The kind of distance that takes years to build and seconds to recognize. He spoke a single sentence. He asked the security officer at the door to escort her out, because her presence was making the room harder to breathe in. She screamed for forgiveness as the heavy timber doors swung shut. The greatest punishment for greed, mate, is the moment you realize you traded something genuine for a pile of polished tin. The final scene played out a fortnight later, in the boardroom of what used to be Whitlock Holdings International. I stood at the head of the long table. The old gray suit was gone. I was wearing a plain charcoal one. Nothing showy, but it carried the weight of a man stepping back into a chair he had simply chosen for 40 years not to sit in. Reginald sat at the other end. His arrogance had drained out of him completely. He looked 10 years older than he had at the wedding. His eyes were fixed on the bankruptcy notice on the table in front of him. Every Whitlock asset had been frozen. The harbourside mansion, the vineyard, the 2 hotels, the fleet of European cars. I had purchased every last one of them, not to keep them, but to remove the family name from any door it had ever hung over in this country. I had bought them so I could erase them. I told Reginald that his greatest mistake had not been financial. His greatest mistake had been believing he could place his shoe on another man's neck and not, eventually, owe a debt for it. Imogen stood in the corner of the room. The $30,000 gown was a memory. She wore a plain blouse from a discount shop. The paternity story had crossed every newspaper in the country. She was no longer just bankrupt. She had become a cautionary tale that mothers would tell their daughters at the kitchen table for years to come. Callum stepped forward and laid one final folder in front of Reginald. It was an arrest warrant. The evidence Amelia had gathered over the last 3 weeks on tax evasion and the misuse of trust funds was more than enough to keep him inside a corrections facility well into his 80s. Reginald's hand shook as he picked up the pen and signed the transfer of everything that was left. Then he looked up at me, finally, and asked me, in a voice barely above a whisper, why I had taken it this far. I leaned forward slightly. My voice was quiet and even. I told him I had done it for every old man at every wedding he had ever held in contempt. I had done it for my son, who had been about to give his name to a woman who would have spent it. And most of all, I had done it for the simple idea that you cannot build a house on the suffering of other people and expect the timbers to hold forever. When pride is your foundation, collapse is only a question of time. The 2 officers at the door stepped forward. The metallic click of the cuffs around Reginald's wrists was the cleanest sound I had heard in a fortnight. He was led out. Imogen sank slowly to the floor, sobbing. I did not look back. Callum and I walked out of that building together, and tomorrow morning, the name Whitlock would be removed from the front of it. In its place, a small brass plate would be installed, bearing the name of my late wife, Eleanor Hardigan, beneath the words Children's Foundation. The revenge was finished. The redemption was only beginning. I sat that evening on the veranda of the cottage. There were no chandeliers above me. There was only a southerly breeze moving through the gum trees and the smell of red earth after the brief afternoon shower. In my hand was a $5 takeaway coffee from the petrol station down the road. The bitterness of it was honest. It tasted better than any of the imported wines I had been served, with a sneer, in the Whitlock dining room. Callum stepped out and sat beside me on the worn timber. He wore a flannel shirt. He looked for the first time in years like a man at peace. He told me he finally understood why I had chosen this small, quiet life for so long. Power is not for showing off, he said. Power is for protecting the people you love and for delivering justice in the few moments when justice has gone missing. I looked at my son and smiled. I told him to remember a few things, because the older I get, the more I believe these are the only lessons that have ever mattered. Never measure another person by the size of their wallet, son. A tailored suit can hide a small man, and a worn-out work jacket can carry a king. Be kind to the waitress, the cleaner, the bloke who sweeps the floor at the petrol station. They are the eyes of the country, and they see far more than the ones in the corner offices. The people who shout the loudest about their wealth almost never have the kind that matters. Real wealth is what is left of you when the bank balance is gone. If a person mocks the powerless, you have already learned everything you need to know about how they will treat you the day you are no longer useful to them. And finally, my boy, be patient. Patience is the most expensive thing a human being can own. because no shop in any country sells it. You earn it slowly, over a lifetime, by sitting through the moments when your pride is screaming at you to react. The coffee in my hand had gone cold, but the warmth in my chest had not. I had kept the promise I made to your mother, Callum, on the afternoon you were born. I had protected you, and I had taught you how to become the kind of man she would have been proud to call her son. The sun lowered behind the line of gum trees, painting the paddocks the color of old copper. I knew that tomorrow we would begin a new sort of work, the kind that put something back into the country instead of taking from it. I set the empty cup down on the veranda railing and stood up. The evening wind grew cooler, but I felt strangely warm. At long last I could smile in the direction of my late wife's memory and tell her quietly that we had done it. We had walked back into the light of an honest life, and we had left the darkness of those proud people behind us, exactly where it had always belonged.